I want to take a closer look at three of the Beatles songs from that first album, Please Please Me, Love Me Do, the song Please Please Me, and I Saw Her Standing There. And start by taking a little bit closer look at what I mean when I say AABA form. Usually when we talk about this, we use capital A, capital A, capital B, capital A, and what we basically mean is there's a first section, the A section, we'll call that the verse, which delivers some lyrics to the accompaniment of certain music. That's then repeated in the second A section, but the lyrics are changed, the music stays the same. Then when we get to the B section, of course, there are new lyrics, but the music is contrasting, so that's why it gets the B designation. And then when we come back to A again, it's the same music as before, but often with new lyrics. And that's sort of the germ or the central part of a lot of pop songs. It's a very, very common thing in American pop music before the rock and roll era. Most people who learn jazz improv by learning to play over standards learn this form because so many of the jazz standards, the original sort of pop songs that that form the jazz standard repertory, use this AABA form. So it really indicates an awareness of pop songwriting when we see it in the music of the Beatles. The traditional arrangement of the AABA form is for each of the sections to be 8 measures in length. A measure is basically a bar of music. 1, 2, 3, 4, that's a bar. So if I got 8 measures, I got 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, right? So until I've done 8 of those. So 8 measures for the A, 8 measures for the A, 8 measures for the B, another 8 measures for the last A. It's often called a 32-bar form or 32 measures form because 8, 8, 8, and 8 equals 32 measures. And so we see this a lot in the Beatles music, the form. One thing about this AABA form is that usually if you just play through the AABA form once, the song's not long enough. So some part of it's got to come back. Either you repeat the entire thing a second time. When the big bands would do these tunes, they would repeat them 3 or 4 times, emphasizing different parts of the arrangement. There'd be saxophones, trombones, the trumpets would take it, maybe a singer would come on and sing the center section of it, whatever, but there'd be these bigger arrangements. Here, now we're talking about the Beatles trying to hit that 2-minute mark. And so oftentimes, if you get all the way through the AABA form, you can stop your audio player and say, okay, based on how much time has elapsed, how much of this song are they going to bring back? If you've only gotten to 1 minute, there's a good chance they're going to bring all of it back. So you're going to get AABA, AABA. But if you've gotten to 1:10 or 1:15 seconds, they're probably not going to be able to bring all of it back. So you're going to get some partial reprise of the original material. So it might go AABA, ABA, lopping off the first A, or AABA, BA, lopping off the first 2 A's and just coming back to the BA. So we'll see that within the AABA form, these various ways of reprising music. Sometimes if the music is slow enough, by the time you've gotten through the whole thing, there's no reprise at all. You've basically just, we'll see one of those in just a minute here too. So this AABA form, all 3 of these songs we're going to talk about are AABA tunes. The first of the early AABA songs we're going to talk about is Love Me Do, mostly a Paul song, and in this case in AABA form with a partial reprise. So we get an introduction, and then we get a 13-bar verse, which makes the first A section, another 13-bar verse, which makes the second A section, an 8-bar bridge, and a 13-bar verse. There's our AABA form, and then we get the partial reprise in the B and the A coming back, and then we get the tag to end the tune. So we're seeing a pretty clear AABA form with partial reprise here. Starts out with harmonica. The Beatles had been really into a song called Hey Baby by Bruce Chanel. Was a #1 hit in the U.S. in 1962. In fact, featured Delbert McClinton on harmonica. So the harmonica comes out, John comes out with the harmonica. You can hear a really strong country influence in this tune, not only with the strummed kind of acoustic guitar, but with the kind of boom, boom, boom kind of bass that you hear Paul McCartney playing. A lot of sort of country coming through, and a lot of 2-part vocals, really kind of in the style of the Everly Brothers, an important model for the Beatles in their music. Paul likes to tell the story of how when they get to the moment where the title of the song "Love Me Do" is said, that they had been doing that sort of in harmony, but now with John having to go to get that harmonica note in right on about where the word "do" falls, he had to drop out, and Paul had to sing that line all by himself. And he talks about how sort of intimidating that moment had been. But you know, if you know Paul McCartney as a little bit from his interviews and stuff, you probably figure out that moment where he got to sing that bit solo probably was his, you know, probably he really went for that moment and made that happen. So I don't think it maybe was as intimidating as he makes it out to be these days. Nevertheless, he does a fantastic job delivering that line, and John's back on the harmonica, and everything's great. When we look at the structure of the actual verse itself, we say it's a verse with refrain, and you'll see in Please Please Me how the refrain, typically in these AABA songs, the refrain in a verse will come at the very end of the verse as the same line that repeats each time. So you get a bunch of lyrics and then a line that repeats, and the next verse has got different lyrics but the same line that repeats. That's the refrain. With this one, you've got the refrain, "Love Me Do," at the beginning. At the end, really, you got "Love Me Do" kind of everywhere. This is maybe not the Beatles in as much control over the subtlety of the lyrics as they will very quickly be. For example, with Please Please Me, it's maybe not the lyrics are not the strong suit here, but there was something obviously very strong about this tune, and good enough to get them a number 17 hit. But of course, they would follow that up with their next single, Please Please Me. We now move on to discussion of Please Please Me, again credited to Lennon McCartney, but being mostly a John song. Please Please Me begins to show the influence of John and his interest in, the influence of John on tricky things going on in lyrics. He was fascinated by what Chuck Berry would do with lyrics sometimes. If you know the song Memphis by Chuck Berry, it has a kind of a surprise ending. If you've never heard it, you should check it out, find a record, because you get told a whole story and then at the end it kind of shifts. It's a very interesting kind of lyrical thing. There are all kinds of little Chuck Berry details that people like John Lennon and even Bob Dylan and others sort of fastened onto as young people and thought, gosh, you know, you can really kind of craft these lyrics. And there was a song by Bing Crosby, had been a hit in 1932. You might wonder, whoa, what's he doing listening to old music? Well, remember, these guys grew up listening to pop music on the radio. You know, their early days was during World War II. There were a lot of Americans in the country at the time. And so you heard Bing Crosby, Frank Sinatra, that kind of thing. And the song from 1932 was a song called Please. And roughly the lyrics have to do with please hear my pleas. And he was always sort of interested in the way the same sound was used to be, you know, two different words like that. And so the song, so he came up with the idea of please please me. And as I said in the previous video, it had initially been a slower song, and George Martin didn't like it that slow, so they sped it up and they got the version that we're used to. Again, we get the harmonica again, the old rule in pop music, especially during this craft phase. That is where they're emphasizing craft as opposed to sort of artistic expression. The Beatles at this point in their songwriting careers were not saying, how do we do something different? How do we say something important? What they were rather doing is, how do we write a good pop song that's going to be a hit? And so the rule is, if something works, do it again. And the harmonicas seem to work in Love Me Do, so here it is again, back in Please Please Me. Again, the two-part vocal. The two-part vocal on this one, if you get a chance to, check out the Everly Brothers song, Kathy's Clown, because the way in which the vocals and the Everly Brothers' Kathy's Clown work, where one voice stays the same and the other one kind of moves against it, are very like what John and Paul do here in Please Please Me, and I got to believe that was a real influence on them. Now you get, in this song, you get a more typical use of the refrain. So when we look at the form, it's another AABA form, and in fact, the song has no reprise at all. It just goes A, B, A, and then there's a tag at the end. So now there's no return of the BA or the ABA or anything. The tune itself is each section is long enough that by the time they get through AABA, they're hitting the 2-minute mark and they got to get out. And so there's no bringing anything back. But if you look at the use of the refrain here, this is after a 4-bar introduction, it's essentially a 16-bar a verse in which the last 4 bars bring back the title of the song, Please Please Me. And that's the typical kind of thing for these AABA forms, is to do a verse that ends with the refrain at the very end of it. Then you do that verse again with different lyrics except the same refrain coming back. Then you do the contrasting bridge like we talked about, and then a return to the verse to complete the AABA form. So this is really a great example from that point of view. Each of the verses is 16 measures in length, so that's 16 plus 16. And then you've got a bridge that's 10 measures in length, and then you return back to a verse that's got, 16 bars plus a tag at the end, so it's essentially 16. So you're no longer getting the 8 plus 8 plus 8 plus 8 that we were talking about that's typical of Tin Pan Alley, but it's really the same design. The one last feature I'd like to draw your attention to is at the very end, there's a kind of adventurous chord sequence at the very end of the tune, the last 4 or 5 chords that go on there, and gets a little bit chromatic or outside the key. And John used to say that our songs were always so full of chords we had to sort of weed some of the chords out of it. But I think there's an influence here of somebody like Tony Sheridan. If you listen to some of the Tony Sheridan records from back in the Hamburg days, he was another one who was big on a lot of these kinds of interesting, adventurous kinds of chord progressions. And thinking about the Beatles sitting there in front of him, it's hard to imagine that they didn't absorb some of that and say, hey, that's kind of cool, I'd like to do that in one of my tunes, remember it that way. And so maybe there's a Tony Sheridan influence there as well. Let's turn to the last of the songs we'll talk about here in this close-up, and that's I Saw Her Standing There. This one, again, credited to Lennon McCartney, but mostly a Paul song. This one, again, an AABA form. It goes AABA, but then it brings back A, B, and A, and the first A in the ABA that comes back is a guitar solo, George Harrison playing guitar solo on that. This is sort of Paul doing Little Richard, something that he did these sort of Little Richard screamers back at Hamburg and the Cavern Club an awful lot. This is kind of his version of it. There's some 2-part harmony here on the refrain in each verse, and during the bridge we get a George guitar solo, which sort of sounds kind of a cross between rock and roll and sort of spy guitar that we might get from somebody like the Shadows, Cliff Richard's backing band that had a lot of hits at the same time that Cliff Richard did. And the entire song is very sort of guitar-driven, reminds us of Chuck Berry. Again, we get a 16-bar verse, which has 8 measures of verse and then 8 measures of refrain. And so the tune itself, again, falling into what we would say is kind of the pattern for the Beatles, using the AABA form to create these tunes of various and kind of contrasting way. I mean, think of the 3 songs we're talking about, all of them in AABA form. Love Me Do, Please Please Me, I Saw Her Standing There. Very different kinds of songs. I mean, not radically different, but certainly they're not writing the same song over and over again. But they are using the same form and a lot of the approaches over and over again. Check out, by the way, on I Saw Her Standing There, the great hand claps that accompany most of the singing all the way through. We're going to get those hand claps back again with I Want to Hold Your Hand, which we'll talk about in a video in just a minute. So having taken a look at taking a close look at these songs from their very first album, let's talk about what was happening with the Beatles in 1963, their success and the effect they had on the UK pop scene during that era.